In the first 90 days of 2026, just 4 companies spent more money than the entire gross domestic product of New Zealand.
Yeah, which is just, it's a staggering metric.
Right. I mean, we are talking about $242 billion. It's a number so incomprehensibly massive that it literally warps the economic gravity around it.
It really does.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today we are unpacking a towering stack of Q1 2026 financial reports, geopolitical analyses, and tech briefings. We really want to show you how this, what they call the capital singularity, is secretly rewiring your electricity bill, your job security, and, well, the entire global balance of power.
Because it's a profound structural shift in the global economy. But to really grasp why $242 billion was deployed in a single quarter, we have to understand what exactly that money is paying for, right? Like, what is actually happening inside these machines?
All right, because if you're listening to this, you've probably used a large language model or, an LLM today. But let's ground this for a second. Imagine you're standing outside on a clear night, looking up at a massive, glittering galaxy.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Yeah, so only instead of stars, every single point of light up there is a word. You look over the one constellation, and you see the word apple, like the fruit, hovering right next to orange and pear.
Right.
But then you look, light years away to a completely different part of the sky, and you see Apple, the company, orbiting right next to Microsoft and Google.
It's a really beautiful way to visualize it, because an LLM does not actually think.
Right. It doesn't have a brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't understand you the way a human does. It's basically using roughly 1.8 trillion parameters,
HR.
which are essentially microscopic mathematical weights. It uses those to navigate that exact galaxy of words you just described. It looks at your prompt, plots a course through those constellations, and calculates the precise probability of, well, what the next word should be.
So it's essentially the autocomplete on your phone, but just scaled up to encompass the entirety of human knowledge.
Yeah, precisely.
And the reason this matters to you, the listener, the reason we're even doing this deep dive, is because 81% of all global venture capital just went into funding those microscopic mathematical weights. Like, this is not just some Silicon Valley inside baseball thing anymore.
Not at all. In fact, calling it venture capital is almost a misnomer at this point.
What do you mean?
Well, in Q1 2026, 4 entities, so OpenAI, Anthropic, xAI, and Waymo, they absorbed $188 billion of that total pie.
Wow.
Yeah. That is 65% of all venture capital on Earth, just swallowed by 4 companies in 90 days.
Wait, let's stop and unpack that terminology really quick. We keep throwing around the phrase, venture capital startup. But if you can't write a $1 billion check just to get a seat at the table, you're locked out.
Oh, completely locked out.
So isn't this just like sovereign-level infrastructure building disguised as a startup funding round?
You've hit on the exact friction point the analysts are highlighting here. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire fund size for a legendary VC firm like Sequoia.
And they funded, what, Apple and Google?
Right, exactly. Their entire fund is only about $15 to $20 billion. They are completely priced out of the apex layer of this race. I mean, this is private equity at a nation-state scale.
Yeah, that's wild.
Just look at OpenAI's massive $122 billion round. That pushed their total valuation to $852 billion. But that headline number is huge. When you look at the financial anatomy of the deal, there is this fascinating mechanism at play that they call phantom cash.
Hold on, phantom cash. The reports show Amazon contributed $50 billion to that OpenAI round. Are you saying they didn't actually wire OpenAI $50 billion?
That is the trick. It's heavily structured as compute credits.
Okay, meaning what?
Amazon essentially told OpenAI, hey, here is a $50 billion investment on paper, but you are strictly required to use a massive chunk of it to pay us for using our Amazon Web Services cloud infrastructure.
You're kidding. So OpenAI is turning around and paying Amazon's server invoices with the money Amazon just invested.
Yeah, exactly that.
That is wild. It's a closed-loop system. They're basically handing OpenAI a $50 billion gift card to Amazon's own store.
Pretty much. But here is where the narrative really flipped in Q1. Everyone talks about OpenAI like they are the undisputed king. But the sources point to a massive shocker, which they call the Anthropic flip.
Oh, right, the Anthropic flip. This was the earthquake of the quarter.
Yeah, Anthropic is valued at $380 billion. That's less than half of OpenAI's valuation, but they actually overtook OpenAI in annualized revenue.
Which is just crazy.
They hit a $30 billion annual run rate compared to OpenAI's $24 billion.
Before we go further, let's translate annual run rate, or ARR, from Wall Street to Main Street. That basically means if you take the money they made this month and multiply it by 12, that's what they're on track to make for the year, right?
Precisely. It's the standard metric for recurring, predictable revenue. And Anthropic overtook OpenAI on that metric while spending 4 times less capital.
How does that even happen mechanically? Like, how do you beat the giant with a quarter of the budget?
It comes down to a fundamental divergence in architectural strategy. So OpenAI went consumer first. They wanted ChatGPT on everyone's phone, acting like the new internet browser.
Right, mass appeal.
Exactly. But Anthropic went enterprise first. They looked at big corporations and realized that banks and hospitals don't want a quirky chatbot. They want relentless compliance, privacy, and, real utility.
Makes sense.
So Anthropic released Claude Code. It's an autonomous coding agent that enterprises actually trusted to integrate deeply into their internal systems. And following that targeted release, Anthropic saw a 5.5x spike in revenue.
Wow.
Yeah, they basically turned trust into a revenue multiplier.
So they built a better mousetrap for the people who are actually writing the check.
Exactly.
But regardless of who is winning the corporate revenue race, you can't just, put $242 billion into a standard checking account. This capital has to physically manifest in the real world somehow.
And it is. It's manifesting in concrete, steel, and silicon. The big 4 hyperscalers, meaning the absolute titans of the industry, operating on a global scale, so Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Meta.
The usual suspects.
Right. They are dropping $700 billion on capital expenditures in 2026 alone.
$700 billion.
Yeah. And capital expenditure, CapEx, is money spent on physical assets, unlike normal operating expenses like, payroll. What's fascinating here is that this money proves the era of the traditional server room is completely dead.
Yeah, we always talk about the cloud like it's this weightless, invisible thing just floating above us. But reading through these architectural briefings, this isn't a cloud, it's more like a digital blast furnace.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. Because unlike traditional servers that just sit in a cool room, these new AI chips run so incredibly hot that they require massive liquid cooling industrial systems.
Yeah.
They are literally pumping water through the racks just to keep the metal from melting.
That is highly accurate. They are building what the industry now calls AI factories. These are gigawatt-scale industrial sites. And this brings us to the cascading energy crisis.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, because these AI data centers are projected to consume 945 terawatt hours of electricity by 2030.
945 terawatt hours.
To put that abstract number in perspective, that is more electricity than the entire nation of Japan consumes in a year.
Which perfectly explains the sudden nuclear renaissance we're seeing.
Right.
Wind and solar are great, but they depend on the weather. A digital blast furnace needs a 247 gigawatt baseload. It cannot afford a cloudy day.
Exactly. That relentless demand is why big tech has signed contracts for over 10 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity in just 12 months.
Unbelievable.
Microsoft signed a $16 billion deal to physically restart the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant.
3 Mile Island.
Yeah. And Amazon is dropping $20 billion on a data center campus right next to the Susquehanna nuclear plant in Pennsylvania. Google is financing fleets of small modular reactors. They are single-handedly reviving the atomic age just to power these models.
But even with all that money and all that nuclear power, there is a massive physical bottleneck in the reports.
Of course.
Right? You can have the electricity, but you still need the actual brains of the operation, the chips.
And this is the manufacturing choke point that keeps these executives awake at night. Because despite $700 billion in physical spending by these tech giants, almost all of it funnels down to one single manufacturer on the other side of the planet.
TSMC.
TSMC in Taiwan. Even though Microsoft and Google are designing their own custom silicon to try and, escape NVIDIA's massive price markups, they all still have to get in line at TSMC to actually get them fabricated.
Right, you can design it, but you can't build it.
Exactly. And to give you a sense of scale, NVIDIA alone has pre-ordered 800,000 silicon wafers from TSMC for 2026.
Okay, so you have these digital blast furnaces waiting on silicon from Taiwan. But once those chips finally arrive and plug into the wall, who pays for the power?
Right.
Because that's where this story leaves the server room and enters your living room. You, the person listening right now, are actually paying for this infrastructure build-out.
You absolutely are. Big tech is paying to build the data centers, sure, but normal families are subsidizing the massive grid expansions required to deliver power to those centers.
Which is brutal.
The financial reports show that in 2025, U.S. residential electricity prices jumped 7.1%. That was more than double the rate of inflation.
Wow.
And if you happen to live in a data center hub like Northern Virginia, you might have seen your electricity prices rise by up to 267% over the last 5 years.
That is a staggering hidden tax on the AI revolution.
Mm-hmm.
You are paying for the compute power through your utility bill. And that real-world impact doesn't stop at your wallet. It moves right into your career.
Yes, it does.
The labor market data shows we have moved entirely away from the 2022-era chatbots, with the reports called probabilistic consultants that just answered questions, and we've entered the era of virtual employees, the AI agents.
This is a really critical distinction. An agent doesn't just give you a recipe. It goes to the grocery store, buys the ingredients, and cooks the meal.
Right.
In a corporate setting, these agents research the client, write the custom code, test the code, send the emails, and book the follow-up meetings. And this capability has created a brutal bimodal labor market paradox.
Which means what, exactly?
On one hand, 73,000 general tech workers were laid off in the first half of 2025 and early 2026.
Right, but on the flip side of that paradox, postings for AI engineers are up 143%.
Exactly.
They're commanding median salaries of $245,000, and chief AI officers are pulling in $500,000 or more. So explain this to me. If AI agents are supposed to be writing all the code automatically now, why on earth are companies paying AI engineers $350,000 a year while laying off tens of thousands of regular software developers?
Well, because AI isn't replacing the entire human workforce, it is hollowing out the middle. It's reshaping about 50 to 55% of roles. The AI seamlessly handles the routine boilerplate syntax.
The boring stuff.
Yeah, the exact repetitive work that was traditionally used to train junior developers. So those entry-level and mid-tier jobs just vanish. However, orchestrating 50 independent AI agents to safely build a secure software product that requires massive systemic architectural knowledge.
Wow.
So the senior architects, the humans who actually know how to manage the AI systems, they become hyper-valuable. The floor falls out and the ceiling skyrockets.
So we're seeing a hollowing out of the middle class in tech, leaving this hyper-concentrated group of senior architects at the bottom.
Wait, and when we look at the top, we see that same terrifying concentration of power, don't we? The sources are incredibly blunt about who is steering this ship.
They really are. The infrastructure the entire global economy now relies on is functionally controlled by just 5 unelected executives.
Let me guess. Sam Altman at OpenAI, Elon Musk at xAI, Sundar Pichai at Google, Andy Jassy at Amazon, and Mark Zuckerberg at Meta.
Just 5 guys.
Mm-hmm.
And their control is absolutely not going uncontested, though. We are seeing major friction in the legal system right now. There are over 50 active lawsuits currently regarding copyright.
Oh, yeah.
The New York Times lawsuit is the most prominent, and OpenAI already quietly settled with a group of authors for an estimated $1.5 billion just to avoid a precedent-setting trial.
Yeah, the courts are finally having to manually decide what constitutes legally obtained training data versus, well, outright piracy.
Right. And that friction extends far beyond copyright into our actual perception of reality. The technology is advanced to the point where video generation models can create flawless synthetic footage.
And the fallout of that was pretty universal. The reports show that highly convincing deepfakes heavily infiltrated the 2026 midterms, deployed equally across left-wing and right-wing campaigns.
Yeah, it didn't matter what side you were on.
Exactly. It became a bipartisan reality where voters across the board simply couldn't decipher synthetic video from authentic footage. It fundamentally altered the information landscape.
Which is exactly why AI is no longer just a commercial product, right? It's the primary geopolitical weapon of the 21st century.
Absolutely. And when we look at the geopolitical board, it's a fascinating asymmetric standoff. The U.S. is completely dominating in sheer financial brute force. I mean, the U.S. invested $258.9 billion compared to China's $12.4 billion.
That is a massive 20-to-1 spending advantage.
It is.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. You would think a 20-to-1 spending advantage would guarantee a total untouchable monopoly for the United States. How is China practically tying the race on a fraction of the budget?
It comes down to what the briefings call open source asymmetric efficiency.
Let's translate that.
Right. Because the U.S. government blocked China from buying NVIDIA's best chips, Chinese labs couldn't use brute force to train their models. They were forced to take open source models, which are free and publicly available, and aggressively strip out all the bloated code.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They made the software so incredibly lean and efficient that it could run on inferior, older domestic hardware from Huawei. They turned a severe hardware disadvantage into a software superpower.
That's brilliant, honestly.
DeepSeek's V4 model narrowed the quality gap with the best U.S. models to just 2.7%. And furthermore, China currently holds 74.2% of all global AI patents.
Wow. So you have the U.S. using an avalanche of cash, China utilizing ruthless software efficiency. What is Europe doing in this tripolar war?
Well, the EU is trying to build a regulatory moat. With the rollout of the EU AI Act, they've prioritized safety and compliance. They're threatening fines of up to 7% of a company's global turnover for violations.
7%?
Yeah. But the risk they're running, according to analysts, is that Europe just becomes a highly regulated museum while the U.S. and China sprint ahead.
And don't forget the Middle East. Sovereign wealth funds from Saudi Arabia and the UAE poured $66 billion into AI this quarter alone.
They did.
They are looking at a post-oil economy and realizing that raw compute power is the next oil. They are hedging their entire national futures on this.
But whenever you see sovereign nations and tech giants pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into a single sector, completely ignoring traditional financial gravity, we have to pause and ask the uncomfortable question.
Right. If you're listening to this and thinking, hey, I've heard this exact story before, this is just the dot-com bubble of 1999 all over again, you aren't alone. Let's look at the bubble dilemma. The sources point to a massive structural flaw called the inference trap.
The inference trap, yes.
OpenAI expects a $14 billion net loss in 2026. Why? You'd think training the model is the expensive part, but actually 80 to 90% of AI costs happen after training, during inference.
And inference simply means the act of the model answering a user's prompt. This is the core of the trap.
Let's ground this. If I build a normal software app, like a calculator, it costs me almost nothing when 1 million people use it.
Right, practically zero.
But with AI, every single time I ask it to write an email, a digital blast furnace somewhere has to do heavy math, costing the company actual fractions of a cent.
Exactly. Unlike traditional software where you build it once and distribute it infinitely for free, an LLM burns real electricity and compute power for every single answer. The more people use the product, the more money the company loses, which absolutely crushes their gross margins.
Yet, despite losing $14 billion, OpenAI is trading at a 36x ARR multiple. Wait, let's translate that from Wall Street to Main Street.
Good idea.
A 36x ARR multiple means investors are paying $36 today for every one Zyre of revenue OpenAI makes in an entire year. That is staggering.
It's massive.
To justify that insane valuation, you have CEOs constantly marketing AGI, artificial general intelligence, a system that can outsmart humans at any task as arriving by 2027. They're telling investors, sure, we lose billions now, but in a year we'll have a digital god that will invent new industries.
Right, the ultimate promise.
But what if AGI stays until 2035? That would be a historic miscalculation.
And that brings us to the most sobering part of the financial analysis, which is opportunity cost. Because capital is finite. What did that $242 billion not fund?
Right.
In Q1 2026, global biotech seed funding had its worst quarter since before the pandemic, securing only $2.3 billion.
Jeez.
To put that in perspective, one single OpenAI funding round equals 53 years of current early-stage biotech funding.
So are we basically starving cancer research, grid modernization, and physical infrastructure just so a virtual sales agent can write slightly better corporate emails?
Well, this raises an important question about the nature of capital today. It's a highly valid concern. But if we compare this to the dot-com bubble, there is a crucial mechanical difference.
What is it?
In the year 2000, startups were borrowing massive amounts of debt, and only 7% of tech companies had actual profits. Today, the big tech hyperscalers driving this boom, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, they are not borrowing this money. They have massive free cash flow generated from their existing businesses, ranging from $15 billion to $33 billion in pure profit per quarter.
So they aren't taking out risky loans to build the blast furnaces. They're spending the war chest they already have sitting in the bank.
Correct. So the risk isn't necessarily a sudden, catastrophic pop of a bubble like we saw in 2001. Financial analysts suggest the real risk is a smooth deflation between 2026 and 2028.
Smooth deflation.
Yeah. If the revenue from these enterprise AI agents doesn't eventually catch up to that $700 billion capital expenditure cycle, the tech giants will just quietly scale back their physical build-outs, and the growth will simply flatten.
So what does this all mean for you? Let's recap. We are looking at an unprecedented 90-day window where $242 billion poured into AI. It is sparking a literal nuclear energy renaissance just to keep the liquid-cooled machines running.
Yep.
We've seen Anthropic use enterprise trust to pull ahead of OpenAI in revenue efficiency, and we're watching a tripolar geopolitical arms race rewrite the global economy, hollowing out the middle class of the tech sector in the process.
It is, without hyperbole, the industrialization of intelligence. But before we wrap up our analysis, if we think back to how we started this deep dive looking up at that glittering galaxy of words, there is a structural paradox hidden in this massive scale-up.
Right. We know these models require astronomical amounts of authentic human-generated data to learn. To build those mathematical parameters, they vacuumed up the entire open internet.
Right, every Wikipedia article, every Reddit post, every digitized book they could get their hands on.
But think about the world we just described. Virtual employees and AI agents are deployed everywhere. They are writing the code, generating the legal tests, writing the news articles, and creating the video content at lightning speed. The internet is rapidly filling up with synthetic AI-generated data.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on as you go about your day. What happens to the next multi-billion-dollar LLM when it runs out of human data?
Yeah.
When it has to train not on the brilliance of human authors, but on the recycled synthetic echoes of other AIs? Will that beautiful, expansive galaxy of words we imagined eventually collapse in on itself, becoming just a degraded copy of a copy?
It is the ultimate bottleneck. Compute power can be manufactured and capital can be raised, but authentic human ingenuity is finite.
It absolutely is.
Something to keep in mind the next time you ask an AI to write an email for you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the AI capital tsunami. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking up at the stars, and we'll catch you on the next one.